and welcome to the Magical Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Jez, and I'm thrilled you're joining us for another fun-filled episode where we sprinkle a little magic on the world of business and leadership. Each week, we dive into fascinating topics that inspire and educate, all while keeping things lighthearted and enjoyable. Magical Learning has been running successfully as a training and facilitation company for over 20 years and has partnered with global thought leaders like Robin Sharma and John Mattone. So whether you're a seasoned leader, budding entrepreneur, or just curious about how to make learning magical, there's something here for you. So grab your favorite drink, grab a snack, and sit back, because it's time for some magical learning. And it's not just me on the call today. It's not just Jez. We've also got some team. And as you would have seen in the title, we've got a guest. But let's jump in with the regular team first and see how they're going. So, Al, you were the first one on. It's always good to have you on a podcast. How's things been this week and how are you going?
I've had a fantastic week this week, Jez. I started training people in the crane industry just a little over 12 months ago. And this week I have now become an assessor, which is taking things to the next level.
Wow. Well, like a crane, you're literally taking things to the next level. And Al, it's great to see that with your professional development.
Thanks, Jez. It was great to have the experience to feel what it's like to be a student where I had to get 100% in my assessments to become an assessor. And as much as I tell the students, don't stress, that does take a little bit of practice.
Well, it's good to know that they have very high standards and that you've met them, Al. Great work. Graham, how are you going this week? How's things?
Hi, Jez. Hi, everyone. Good. Thank you. I love the intro. Sprinkle a little magic dust. All words to that effect. I'm in Canberra at the moment, still trying to wrap my head around a concept that I've just learned about today, which is interesting. Something called Valentino's Day. Anyway, I can get away with that because my significant other is currently on the other side of the planet, and by the time she gets to see this recording, well, it won't be Valentine's Day. Good to be here, as always.
Yes, people will be hearing this at some point in March and be wondering what's going on. But yes, the official recording date is Valentine's Day.
I just gave a bit of that was the clue, folks, if you weren't paying attention before.
That's it. That's the peek behind the curtain of the Magical Learning Podcast right there. And our guest, Claire Gray, how are you going this week? How's things?
Yeah, I've had a really good week. I was in Sydney at the SCG facilitating a feedback and coaching session with a new client, which was great. We kicked off our Thriving Leaders program, which is our online program, yesterday. And then this morning I was a podcast interviewer for the first time, interviewing kind of my hero in the team and leadership development space, Amy Edmondson. So I feel like I'm quite elated after that experience, and hopefully I don't copy too much of what she said this morning into our discussion today, because she did talk a lot about psychological safety and accountability. So it's all fresh in my mind.
That's fantastic, Claire. And before we get into anything, where can people find this podcast? Do you know where that's going to be going out?
It'll be on Spotify and Apple and wherever you get your podcasts. We're just finishing season 1, so it probably won't be out until March and April, but that's when this podcast is going out as well. So it'll be not too far after you listen to this. Yeah.
Well, that's exciting. They can go straight from this podcast to listening to you interview. So interviewee to interview, two sides of the same coin. Is there anything she can't do? Claire, people may be listening to you here and going, okay, you've got a podcast, you're interviewing interesting people, you're working at the SCG. Who is Claire Gray? So for new listeners that may be being introduced to you for the first time, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a leadership and team coach and facilitator. So I do a lot of leadership development programs based on my Thriving Leaders book and program. I also do one-off workshops. I do a lot of work with leadership teams. So I've just started writing Thriving Teams, which is what I was interviewing Amy for earlier today. So work with leadership teams, and I also do conference emceeing and keynote speaking.
Fantastic. Well, we're very excited to have you on today. The topic, you sent through a couple of topics, so I think we're probably going to have you on for a couple of episodes. But the one topic that you sent through that I've selected for today is the art of accountability. This is a very interesting one, and I like how it's phrased. So I think before we get into any of the questions, you just want to tell us a little bit how you came to this topic.
Yeah. So it's an interesting one because I think accountability gets a bad rap. It's a bit of a dirty word in the corporate world because people kind of think about blame, they think about finger pointing, they might think about micromanagement because they've had a bad experience with accountability. Whereas I think of it very differently. Like I think accountability is a privilege. If someone's giving you ownership to take something on, they must really trust you. And I think that's a bit of a negative rap about accountability. And I'm kind of here to kind of change that in terms of how people look and perceive accountability.
Well, that sounds fantastic. And I think that today we're really excited to get into these questions. I like that we're going to be tackling it from a couple of different perspectives here, and we're excited to get your thoughts on it. So I might start with Danette's questions because I just think it's a good framing question. And for people that are listening, Danette, unfortunately, is in South Africa. Can't be on the podcast, but we'll see her soon, hopefully. But she's still sending the question for you here, Claire. So here we go. First question is, what is accountability? And the second one is, why do people avoid accountability?
Yeah. So my definition of accountability is about a commitment. It's about delivering on a commitment. It's about, taking initiative to follow through on what you're responsible for. And it's really about that ownership. So when we think about accountability, I like to think about it as the quality in terms of the timeframes of what's expected and when it's expected by. And it's also about ensuring people have the skills and knowledge, to be accountable. So if we think about accountability from an individual's perspective, you should feel honoured that someone's giving you accountability. From a leadership perspective, you kind of got this parallel process. You're individually accountable for the work that you do, but you're also accountable for your team. So there's more than one layer to accountability. And as a leader, accountability is really about providing clarity. Because what I often find is, people throw around that there's a lack of accountability, but there's often an underlying issue, and it often sits with the leader when there is a perceived lack of accountability too. As a leader, we need to be really clear about how we're setting expectations about why we're doing something, how and what we're doing and by when, rather than just assuming someone's understood that.
Wow.
And then there was a second part to the question, wasn't
yes,
there? It was,
yes, I was
why
going
do
to say.
people avoid it? Yeah. So why people avoid it is, as I said before, I think it gets a bit of a bad rap. I think people avoid it because of blame and finger pointing. I think from an individual perspective, sometimes people don't want to take on that additional burden, and it might feel a little bit overwhelming to people as well. I also think that there is this link with psychological safety and accountability. So, people fear failing and they don't want to get things wrong or make a mistake. And so often they might shift the blame or deflect things and not take ownership of things. And so that's why I also think it gets a bad rap, because it takes a bit of vulnerability to say, hey, I made a mistake, or because I think humans generally want to kind of save face and they want to be perceived as doing a really good job. And so sometimes when we don't always follow through or do things the way we'd hope to do them, and sometimes people can kind of hide things. And that's when I guess accountability gets a bit of a bad rap.
Well, I mean, that's such an interesting perspective already. I think to put it in such a positive thing, because you're right. I mean, when I think of it, I have so many negative connotations. So this is, I think, a great conversation to unwork a lot of those. But I think speaking of leaders, Graham's got a great question. So Graham, do you want to tell us about your question and a bit about why you chose it as well?
Looking at the broader sort of picture in terms of business, society, etc., and a lot of the nonsense that we're subjected to around artificial intelligence, and what I'd sort of, it's not my term, but I use the term in the question, non-human content rather than AI. I don't think it really matters. So it's just there's so much information, disinformation, misinformation, and it on some levels is becoming a lot harder to separate what was created or said or what represents a human as opposed to what doesn't. And so, following on from that, so we have people, allegedly, it's hard to tell, but where we have people in organisations who are sharing content or information, etc., particularly digitally, and then not keeping themselves or holding themselves accountable for the consequences of that. How do you then engage in meaningful conversations with leaders in organisations, etc., when it's, and I guess I'm curious as to whether you're seeing a pattern of behaviour that we still tend to point to the people who aren't holding themselves accountable to say, well, I don't really need to, because I'm really busy right now anyway, and there's so much rubbish coming on out there, so why should... And it sort of goes back a little bit to your comment that you made about how we can sometimes see that accountability piece as being, well, it's just more pressure on me, and I've got enough pressure on me at the moment. Now, for those listening in, trying to make sense of all that, I actually changed from English to Latin partway through. So if you didn't understand it, it's you, not me. Claire, did that make any sense at all? And if so, just hit me with an answer, please.
Yes.
Put me out of my misery.
So a couple of things coming up for me hearing that question is, I think there's this perception that with AI coming in, things become less human. And I actually feel like it's the opposite. And I think about what's happened over the last couple of years. So in the context of accountability, I would say in 2023, the employee market was really hot. Like if you wanted to jump ship and go to another organization, the grass was greener and people were, it was really hard to retain people. And because of that, a lot of leaders avoided having tough conversations. Then put on top of that psychosocial safety legislation coming in around now leaders need to be accountable for the mental health and well-being as well as the physical well-being of our people meant that leaders were like, hey, I don't want to have difficult conversations because don't want to be perceived as being a bully. And so last year I saw a real increase in leadership workshops specifically around feedback and around accountability. So it was almost like leaders had lost that skill. They unlearned that skill. So to like your question about AI coming in, I almost feel like as leaders, we need to actually get better at having the conversations. I think the conversations are more important now than they have ever been in the past as well. And I think the one good thing about AI is when we're using AI, it's forcing us to communicate more clearly and communicate our expectations more clearly than we have had to in the past. Because in the past, you'd tell someone what they needed to do, but it might be quite ambiguous. The goalpost might shift and you might not even really be sure yourself exactly what it is that you want. But if you ask AI to do something, you need to be very specific. So I think that's one benefit of having AI. We're getting clearer of what our expectations actually are too. But also, I also think that to your point about the amount of information and misinformation that's happening all the time is like as leaders, and this I think is a really important link to accountability, we need to make our work more transparent and more visible so that people can hold each other accountable rather than it being people being protective and kind of hiding what they're working on as well. So I think trying to make things a bit more visible, because we know that peer accountability is really helpful. A little bit of peer pressure in a positive way is actually helpful because you want to follow through on the expectations that you've given other people as well. So hopefully that answered your question. I'm not sure if I 100% did. So
I'm
there's
pretty
a follow-up question.
I'm pretty sure you nailed it. The last point, do you find that point you made about teams holding each other accountable, so the accountability isn't just a top-down driven thing, that can also be a sign or the absence of a sign of a healthy or good culture? And I know we use the term culture in the workplace in so many different ways, but from my perspective, just thinking about having a team where everybody feels comfortable to, again, respectfully, in a safe and then respectful way, provide feedback to somebody else who may not be holding accountability.
100%. It's a huge part of what I'm writing about at the moment in my Thriving Teams book. It's that interlink between accountability and psychological safety and being able to challenge each other and hold each other accountable. And you need to be able to have psychological safety and some trust in place to be able to do that. It's like the balance between challenging and supporting and getting that balance right as well. Because when it's not there, that's when it's hard to hold each other accountable because people feel like they're driving their own agendas or they, don't have the best interests of the team at heart because maybe they're looking after their own patch.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Claire.
Yeah, amazing, Claire. Thanks for that. And I think certainly having tried to communicate with AI sometimes, so even this podcast, people can check out some of our team episodes where I've tried to AI generate artwork. The results have been mixed, with some good and some deeply cursed, I would say. So, yes, certainly I understand what you're talking about there, where you have to become better at communicating these things. Al, did you have a question here today for Claire?
Yes, once I worked out where the mute button is. Claire, you were talking about the leader keeping the team accountable, and you mentioned having clear expectations, how we want, what we want, and when we want it by, and you mentioned blame is sort of one of the things we fear. I guess I'm wondering, where do we go when we've communicated clearly what we want and we're still not getting it as the leader? My mind's going to consequences. But I've also heard the carrot and stick idea is something that doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, it's really funny. The C word does not go down well in workplaces, consequences. So I have a 4 C's model of accountability, and between us, and I also tell people when I'm facilitating as well, the 4th C actually was consequences, but I changed it to communicating outcomes just because of the reaction I would get from the word consequences. It really triggered people because people perceive consequences always as being negative, and there is also positive consequences to things. So it was just really interesting how triggering that is. So I can share the 4 C's model if that's helpful, because I think that kind of addresses how you check in as well. Because the 4 C's model stands for capability, clear expectations, checking in, and then communicating outcomes. So when we, first of all, before we can give someone work, we need to assess whether they have the capability to do what's expected of them as well. So sometimes it might be picking someone who this plays their strengths, or it could be an opportunity for them to learn because they don't have the skills. So what sits within capability is often asking some really good open-ended questions of people about how they're going to approach something to gauge their capability level. rather than asking a closed question like, can you do this or have you done this before? Actually seeing how they'd approach it will give you a bit more information about where their skill level is. If they don't have the skills, how are you going to upskill them? Is it something that you're going to coach them on or train them on? Is there someone else that they can work with to give them some advice? But really thinking about the capability and upskilling them, because sometimes when we look back at times where we feel like someone wasn't accountable, maybe we actually didn't ensure they had the right capability to start with. Then the second C is about having clear expectations. So I think as leaders, sometimes we can expect people to be mind readers and like have all this knowledge that we've got, but we haven't actually articulated what it is that we want. So really clearly articulating your expectations. With someone who might be new to a role or less capable, you might be really, really clear about what that expectation is. For someone who's quite talented or, one of your high potential people, you might actually co-create what that expectation is as well. What also sits in clear expectations isn't just about being clear about what's expected, but it's about being clear about what the measure of success is. So what does good look like? It doesn't have to be something that's quantitative. It can be something qualitative, but what does good look like? What does success look like? Are you expecting a 2-page report or are you expecting a 10-page report? Because when you get that 10-page report back and you're like, oh, I just wanted 2 pages, you're going to get quite frustrated. So what does good look like? So another tip there when we're setting clear expectations is actually asking some good coaching questions and getting them to play back in their own words what they're going to do can be really helpful, because then you know that they've understood, rather than just saying something like, do you get, has this landed for you? Yes. Actually getting them to play back in their own words, because then you'll realize whether they've understood what the expectation is. So the third C is around checking in. So this is about creating feedback loops so you can give feedback about how things are going. So this is to your point about people get frustrated because what I expected wasn't different, but maybe we're waiting for someone to complete something and we haven't given them any feedback loops along the way. I think agile, about having those regular feedback conversations so you can fail fast is probably a way, like they role model doing this all the time, but it's about giving feedback and being really clear about when you're going to check in with someone, because it's a balance between micromanaging and giving someone autonomy to get something done as well. This is also very dependent on the piece of work. We don't do this for tiny pieces of work, obviously, but this is for something that's a bit meatier and chunkier. So really being clear on how we're going to check in so we can give feedback and what's that cadence for feedback too. And the final one, which is really consequences, which is communicating outcomes, is we need to let people know how they've gone. And so I've got 3 R's to really make sure that we do communicate the outcomes. So if someone does something really, really well and we're super impressed, this is where we want to reinforce, we want them to know really specifically what about it was so great. You might want to praise them publicly and acknowledge their hard work as well. And over time, that might lead to other rewards for them, whether that's reward and recognition, promotions, pay rises, those sorts of things as well. They're all demonstrating a positive reinforcement. The second R is the one that gets forgotten the most, and that's the redo. So that's where often, that 10-page reports come in, but you've got a deadline, you start editing it, and then you actually don't go back and give feedback and to your person, or don't get them to redo it themselves. Then the next time they do that, you're going to get really frustrated because they've done the same thing again, but you haven't actually given them the opportunity to learn. We know that adults learn better from doing themselves. I fully appreciate we don't always have the luxury of time of doing that. So sometimes it might be tracking changes and having a conversation later if you do have a deadline, but making sure there's the redo or a learning loop of some sort. And the last R is release. And I know I'm going to make this sound really, really simple, but sometimes, when someone hasn't performed and met expectations, we might need to, if we've given feedback, we might need to release them from that task or from the job, because there's nothing worse than being a square peg in a round hole. And sometimes there does need to be some negative consequences, but in the long run, it's more positive both for the individual, the team and the organisation if you address those issues sooner rather than later.
That is fantastic, Claire. I've just jotted down a whole page of notes. So I'm going to have to go back to listen to that in more detail, but that really answers my question well. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Al.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Claire. And great question there, Al. And Claire, I really like what you're saying, and I think it leads really nicely into my question here. My question was, what is the art in the art of accountability? But it's so fascinating because what you were just talking about is, when I was thinking about art when I originally thought of this question, I thought, Mel, maybe it's about tact or something, but you're really talking about there's a lot of different elements that are kind of at play. So yeah, I'd love to know, what is the art in the art of accountability?
Yeah. And I wish that I had a beautiful picture to show you or something artistic, but the thing that I am working on at the moment in the book and I'm starting to write about right now is to do with this ripple effect that happens when we do have the art of accountability. And I like to think of accountability on 3 levels. So you've got your individual accountability, which is essentially what we've just talked about within the 4 C's. This is about the personal ownership, the expectations, the goals that we set for ourselves as individuals. Then there's mutual accountability. And mutual accountability is shared between team members or within a team. So these are our shared goals and the independencies we have of each other as well. And then there's the collective accountability. And so collective accountability is far more systemic, and it's really about between teams because, teams, high performance doesn't happen just within one team. We have the interconnectedness with other teams as well. And so collective accountability is really about how teams work systemically together and the interconnected dependencies that happen between teams. And that's what influences culture, going back to Graham's point before about culture. And so it might sound like an ideal to have this individual, mutual, and collective accountability, but I do think if we focus on those 3 levels, we really shift from those negative, blame, finger pointing to having teams that aren't driving their own agendas because they're supporting each other in terms of shared accountabilities. And then it helps break down silos that often happen when we're just looking after our own patches as well. So I guess the art of accountability is really looking at accountability from an individual, a mutual and a collective accountability perspective, rather than it just being my own accountability, which we only have control over our own accountability, but we can influence the mutual and collective accountability too.
Wow, that's it's really fascinating. I was just wondering, I think this has just really spawned this question for me. So hopefully you don't mind just another improvised question just quickly. Just in terms of being better at doing a collective accountability, is there any tips that you'd have for that? I find that really fascinating.
Yeah. So collective accountability is like one of the first things I think is really important is identifying who your key stakeholders are and kind of mapping out who are my key stakeholders that impact my work, but also I impact their work. And what are my relationships like with those stakeholders? And then being really intentional about how you're going to build relationships that might not be as successful as you would hope, and being quite conscious of how you contribute to that relationship as well. Because we kind of contribute to the messiness of teamwork. And so kind of putting the mirror up to ourselves to see how we actually contribute. And then I think it's also about how we interact and have really rich conversations from both listening to what others are saying, but being curious and sort of suspending judgment and coming from a place of curiosity.
Wow. Well, fantastic. Again, I'm like Alan. I'm just absolutely jotting down these notes. I unfortunately only have a loose leaf bit of paper, so I'm going to have to really make the space work here. I've got a question here from Kanika. What are some red flags to look out for early on that a person may not be good at accountability? Maybe look at this from both a hiring perspective and as a potential employee looking to work at an organization. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting question because I do think like going through a hiring process is quite interesting in the sense of some people are really good at interviewing, and then when they show up for day one, the person you thought you interviewed and the person who shows up are 2 different people. So that's why I think getting multiple people to have different types of conversations when we're interviewing is really, really important. But the things that I would be looking out for is, whether someone demonstrates accountability is, in some of their examples when you're interviewing, are they demonstrating that they took ownership? Are they someone who shows that they learned from their mistakes? So I like asking a question, what would you do differently? And often if someone says, I wouldn't do anything differently, that's okay. But as long as they kind of follow it up with something that they learned, or even asking, like, what did you learn from that? And, if someone responds, oh, no, I didn't really learn anything from that because I did it exactly how I should have, I would think, does this person really have a growth mindset? Are they really reflecting on improving and getting better? For me, that would be a little bit of a red flag because I'd want someone to demonstrate they've got a growth mindset and be able to show some vulnerability. I know interviews aren't a natural type of interaction that people have because they feel like they're being put on the spot and they're trying to show their best selves. But I do think showing that you do learn and that you're curious as well, I think they're probably 2 things that I would look out for, curiosity and their ability to learn in terms of a growth mindset. And so some red flags would be like they didn't take ownership, they haven't learned from their mistakes or shown some vulnerability. And I also think for employees within teams, people who are often finger pointing and deflecting and placing blame on others probably aren't necessarily looking at how they're contributing to what's actually happening with the situation as well. And so sometimes it might be helping team members surface some of their interpersonal differences so they can draw a line in the sand and move forward together.
Wow. Well, great tips there, Claire, and so fascinating. Your analysis on this is a really interesting lens, so that's really good. Let's jump into our last question here, which is from Allegra. And Allegra's written, how can we all feel better about taking accountability?
Yeah. So I think Like the first thing that comes to mind is how we can change our mindsets about what accountability is. And, Jez, you said before that you get the icks or kind of negative connotations when you hear accountability, but actually shifting it to being a privilege because someone's, seeing that you've got the capability to deliver on that. They're giving you ownership. They're trusting in you. So really kind of changing our mindset about what accountability means, I think is the first step. I think also personally kind of shifting away from either linking how we deliver things to our self-worth. It's our natural tendency to kind of link things to our identity. So trying to kind of de-link that and realizing that, making mistakes and failing or doing things not perfectly helps us learn and grow. We learn from our mistakes more than we kind of learn from our successes too. If you're someone who feels like you want to be more accountable, one of the things that I really highly recommend is get an accountability buddy. So there's lots of studies about that if you actually tell someone about your goal that you're 65% more likely to do it. And then if you actually have an accountability buddy and actually check in with each other, you're 95% more likely to do something about it. So it's a really great way of getting someone to kind of collaborate with, but someone to hold you accountable to your accountabilities. And it's actually something I did last year. As I was coming up to turning 40, I wanted to run 10 kilometers. I'd never run 10Ks before. And I kind of publicly used it as an example when I did a keynote on accountability. And then I ended up doing it within 3 weeks, but it was really, really slow. So then I changed my goal to being running 10 kilometers in an hour, which meant I was taking like 14 minutes off my time. So it was like a big difference. My first run was very, very slow. And it was really interesting because my behavior, like I had another 10 weeks to kind of hit this goal before my 40th birthday. But because I had publicly put it out there to a room of 180 people, and then I also followed it up with a LinkedIn post, I was like, oh, bloody hell, I have to do it. And so like having that transparency and visibility of what your goals are and having that accountability meant that I actually, with a week to spare, ended up doing it thanks to my brother and his dog Mav, who kind of ran me so that I could do the 10 kilometers. So I guess the other thing is like make your goals really visible. When I decided to write Thriving Leaders, the day I decided to write it, I went onto LinkedIn and I wrote a post saying, I'm going to write this book. I'm putting this out there for some accountability. And then on the Monday, I sat at my desk and I thought, shit, now I've got to write this book. And so sometimes making your goals visible of what you're trying to achieve can also be another helpful tool as well.
That all sounds great, Claire. And it sounds like I need to get a dog accountability buddy to get my run started. So Mav, let's hopefully we can get him hired out. Or
he's in Melbourne, so that is a bonus for you. Yeah,
great. That sounds good.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Claire, this has been such a great conversation. I've taken so many notes, and I know the team has as well. And so I just thought I'd get them to share some final thoughts. So Al, I might start with you. Al, did you have any final thoughts on today's conversation and the art of accountability?
Thank you so much for today, Claire. I've learned so much. I love that 4Cs model where I was looking down at the consequences or the communicating outcomes versus I've got so many other steps in between where now I can see, consequences aren't necessarily the answer. If we can set people up for success along the way, accountability can work really well for everybody.
Thanks for that, Al, and thanks for your questions today and stuff. Always good to see you. Graham,
yes.
No problem. Graham, did you have any final thoughts on today's conversation and the art of accountability?
So many. Hard to know where to start. Claire, thank you. It's been amazing having you on, and I think we definitely need to invite you back if you will tolerate it again. I was really worried. I thought you set the bar obliquely but extremely well early on when you shared how excited and pumped you'd been to host a podcast with Amy Edson. Then held us accountable to ensure that we kept you at that level rather than this was the great anticlimax, which it often is. I love the 4Cs, the Rs. Kanika's question about thinking about working for a company or the job interview thing reminded me of Robin Sharma used to say that a job interview was a meeting of two liars, which suggests, and he meant it in a nice way, but it sort of can be. The accountability buddy is a tool we've used before, and I agree 1,000,000%. Yes, amazing consequences. I was also thinking when you were sharing about your 10K run, congratulations, well done, that some of the people who purport to be leaders in the world at the moment would decide a day after having said that they were going to run 10K in under an hour, that was just far too challenging, and they would simply issue an executive order to change the length of a kilometre, just saying. It's been great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. And I'd love to come back closer to launching Thriving Teams because I've got lots more to say about teams as well. Yeah.
we'll hold you accountable to that. So what date will it be available specifically and time?
Well, I've decided not to give myself a hard deadline, which is quite interesting for me because I get quite excited and give myself unrealistic expectations. So I'm trying to get better at that. But I'm hoping it will be launched sort of around September, October timeframe. Yeah.
We'll keep an eye out for it. We'll definitely be back in touch.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and thank you for being on. I mean, I have so many different notes. I mean, I love how you just put failure as a growth thing as well. So that's a sort of different model to think about with accountability as well. How can we use this as a growing opportunity and what have you? But it's sort of fascinating. This has actually reminded me just quickly of a job interview where someone was too accountable, and I don't think they got the job. I think this is kind of fascinating. So I did a job interview for the Melbourne Star, which is like our Melbourne's London Eye, but much worse. It could only see one side of Melbourne because the buildings were taller than it. So you're just really looking at one landscape. And it was a group interview. And, they're just asking questions. Oh, when was the time that you took additional responsibility or something? And what are your hobbies and what have you? And me and this other dude were just saying normal answers. One time this person was sick and I stepped up or whatever. And then this other person, their every answer related to their passion of doomsday prepping and getting physically sort of into like they'd go down to storm drains during the rain and like work on climbing out of the storm drain. And it was so fascinating because it was actually, I think, almost too accountable, where people were like, this person, I think, in an emergency would feel it too much that they need to be the one to go and save people in the Melbourne Star. So anyway, that was an interesting example. I think they ended up doing one shift, and I think that was it. But anyway, so that was my takeaway and random topic. But Claire, before we leave, did you have any final thoughts that you had for people about the art of accountability and today's conversation?
I guess my final thoughts are that accountability is a privilege, like I've said a couple of times, and that, we learn when we fail. And I think being comfortable with failure is really critical. But just look at accountability as someone's trusting you and giving you ownership, and it should be a privilege.
Fantastic. Well, Claire, it's been an amazing conversation. Now, people would have been listening to this and gone, all right, I need to reach out to Claire. I need to find out a little bit more. I need to have a chat with her. Where's the best place for people to reach out to you?
Reach out to me through my website. So it's thrivingculture.com.au, or connecting with me through LinkedIn.
Fantastic, Claire. Well, I want to say thank you so much. What an amazing conversation we've had. I feel like I've learned so much, taken so many notes. Alan Graham, thank you so much for great questions and great insights. Claire, thanks for being great on the podcast. Everybody that's been sharing, we're now over 4,000 subscribers on YouTube, so very exciting. And as always, everybody, have a magical week.